Welcome to another Fun with Crypto. Today we will truly get to know how public key infrastructure works and how clients can use it to cryptographically authenticate the identity of servers over an untrusted network. Public key infrastructure, better known as PKI, has an architecture that starts with a certificate authority that is the root of trust and to which all entities are referenced cryptographically. Probably the best known root of trust authorities are the ones shown here. But there are many other root of trust certificate authorities out there that your browser inherently trusts. In addition to these so-called public certificate authorities, enterprises often create a dedicated private PKI because the enterprises can more tightly control the trust of the PKI chain of certificates and because the private certificates are free, whereas obtaining a certificate from a public certificate authority costs money. The root of trust certificate authority, more commonly called the root CA, gets initialized by generating a public-private key pair, as we have seen in many previous videos. Then, the root CA generates an X509 certificate using the standard from the RFC 5280. The certificate consists of the subject, the issuer, the public key, and a number of other fields as we'll see along the way. The subject is the holder of the private key. It includes the subject's common name, organization, and the location of the organization. The issuer is the certificate authority that issues the certificate and includes similar values as the subject. For the root certificate, and only for the root certificate, the subject and issuer will be the same entity and have the same common name, organization, and location. This is referred to as a self-signed certificate, and only the root CA has a self-signed certificate. The X509 certificate has many other fields, including the not valid before and not valid after dates. But for brevity, this video will represent the X509 certificate by the common name of the subject and issuer only. Next, the public key is added to the certificate. Then we need to cryptographically prove that nothing on the certificate has been altered. To do this, we hash the entire certificate and then encrypt the hash with the private key of the root CA. This encryption of the hash by the private key is known as signing the hash. We now have our root CA, and that CA can issue certificates, but we need a mechanism by which certificates can be revoked, and that clients can check to see whether or not the certificates have been revoked. Initially, PKI invented the Certificate Revocation List, or CRL, and required that all clients validating X509 certificates of servers download the whole list of revoked certificates and check to see if the server certificate is on the revoked list. More recently, the Online Certificate Status Protocol Responder, or OCSP responder for short, was invented. It downloads the certificate revocation list, and thus the client can ask the OCSP responder whether or not the certificate of the server is on the list. In order to maintain the chain of trust, the OCSP responder will need its own certificate. So here we will see the generation of the first certificate by the root CA. The OCSP responder generates its own key pair and makes a certificate signing request of the root CA. The request includes its public key and the fields of the subject as described previously. The root CA uses this information to create an X509 certificate. It adds its name as the issuer, hashes the certificate, and encrypts the hash with its secret key. Then it returns the certificate to the OCSP responder. Finally, we need a way for enterprises and other organizations to request certificates for their servers, such that the organization can prove it deserves to be trusted, for example, that it rightfully owns a DNS name and therefore should be issued a certificate for that DNS name. This entity is called the Registration Authority, and abbreviated RA. At this point, the certificate authority has been set up such that it can act as a trusted third party. So let's see how an enterprise would request a certificate for a server. Specifically, let's look at the enterprise that owns the top-level domain name acme.com, and it wants to create a certificate for the server hosting its company website. Then, typically, it uses a PC to generate a key pair and make a certificate signing request to the registration authority of the public CA. Through some out-of-band means, the public CA will verify the person making the request truly owns the domain name and will then forward the request to the certificate authority to generate the certificate. Note that here we use the root CA to sign the certificate. In practice, this would never happen. The root CA of a public PKI would never sign the certificate of a server. Rather, a subordinate CA to the root CA would do the signing. But that is just an iteration on what you're about to see. The certificate authority creates an X509 certificate, adding the subject and the subject's public key, adds the issuer's information and a number of other fields, hashes the entire certificate, and encrypts the hash with its private key to make the certificate cryptographically chained to the root CA. The certificate is then returned to the requester. The requester then transfers the private key and the public certificate to the server hosting the company's website, and the company now has its website hosted with PKI such that users can access with HTTPS, the encrypted form of web browsing. Now let's see how the chain of trust allows a client computer to verify that the server, supposedly hosting the company website, can be trusted to be the actual host of the website. First, we need to add our user and the DNS server of the network. And we have to remember that the user's browser already has a whole bunch of root certificates on it, root certificates that it inherently and completely trusts. When a user types https://acme.com into the browser, the computer's operating system reaches out to its DNS server to get the IP address of acme.com. Let's say it gets back 123.123.123.123. The client then performs a TLS handshake with the server, during which it receives the server's certificate, and typically the chain of certificates between the root CA and the CA that actually signed the web server certificate. Recall that in this example, we did not include any of those intermediate CAs, but in the real world, there would be intermediate CAs. Now the client begins authentication of the certificate. The first step may be that the client verifies that the subject common name of the cert matches the host name of the URL. And the second step may be that the IP address of the server matches the IP address returned from the DNS name lookup. Note that, depending on the browser, these first two steps may occur in a different order or later in the authentication. It depends on the implementation. Next, the client checks that the not valid before and not valid after dates of the certificate are valid at the present time. With these initial checks done, it's time for some crypto to validate the certificate. It starts by finding the root certificate in its key store, that is, the root cert that signed the server's certificate. As mentioned previously, the root CA should never directly sign the server certificate, rather a subordinate CA does the signing. But for brevity here, we will assume the root CA signed the cert. Therefore, the client decrypts the signature on the server's certificate using the public key of the CA that signed the cert, in our case the root CA, performs its own hash of the certificate, and compares the two hashes. If they match, then the root CA generated the server certificate. Again, usually this step takes multiple iterations of subordinate CAs, but the steps are the same. Now the client needs a way to determine that the server is in possession of the private key. Different TLS suites do this differently. For the Galois counter mode suite described in a previous video, the server encrypts the client random, the server random, and the Diffie-Hellman parameters, and sends the encrypted information to the client. The client then uses the server's public key from the server's certificate to decrypt the client random and other parameters, and compares the client random it sent to the server to the decrypted version of the encrypted one it got back. If they are equal, then the server must have the private key associated with the public key on the certificate. Finally, the client needs to know if the certificate has been revoked. To do this, it gets the URL of the OCSP responder from the server certificate and gets the serial number of the certificate from the certificate, both are part of that other stuff that is on the certificate, and sends the serial number to the OCSP responder. The OCSP responder checks the certificate revocation list, and assuming the certificate has not been revoked, the OCSP responder will mark it as good for a period of time, and put that reply in an OCSP response along with the serial number, and will hash and sign the response. Note that this is not an X509 certificate. Rather, this is an OCSP response as defined by RFC 6960. The OCSP responder then returns the response to the client. Like before, the client must download the cert from the OCSP responder, verify it, decrypt the hash provided by the OCSP responder, generate its own hash of the certificate, and compare the two. Finally, the client can now trust the server to be hosting the service it says it's hosting. Or can it? If you talk with enough people about PKI, someone is bound to say that PKI is broken. Well, is PKI broken? Well, no, the technology is sound. But is it broken in some other way? Well, yes, it can be. Previously, we talked about how the installation of a browser also downloads 1 to 200 trusted root certificates. Any compromise in the chain of certificates to the root means a compromised PKI. That's what happened to Google when adversaries compromised DigiNotar's issuing CA and issued certificates to the adversaries that cryptographically proved that the adversaries were Google. Similarly, there's an attack known as a root cert injection attack, whereby the adversary injects its own root certificate into the browser's set of trusted roots. This results in the victim's computer trusting the adversary for all certificates presented to the victim. In addition, for servers on the internet, the subject's common name in the server certificate is a host name, not an IP address. Therefore, DNS spoofing can enable man-in-the-middle attacks by returning the IP address of an adversary instead of the IP address of a legitimate server. Finally, the fact that the PKI infrastructure enables revocation checking also opens up a denial of service attack by flooding the OCSP responder with lots of requests. If the OCSP responder cannot reply to legitimate requests, the denial of service attack effectively shuts down the servers using that PKI infrastructure. Wow, that's a lot of concerns. But can these issues be fixed? Yes, they can. Let's take a look at the software-defined perimeter protocol, which fixes all of them. A software-defined perimeter uses a dedicated PKI with pinned certificates, which means the software-defined perimeter client will not trust the many root certificate authorities out there. It will only trust the dedicated PKI associated with a specific software-defined perimeter. Therefore, compromising a public CA will not affect the trust relationship within the software-defined perimeter architecture. It also means that injecting additional root certificates won't affect the software-defined perimeter protocol because in the software-defined perimeter protocol, it only trusts the software-defined perimeter root certificate, not an injected root certificate. And the software-defined perimeter is immune to DNS spoofing because the common name on each server certificate is an IP address, not the host name of the server, something that can be spoofed. Finally, all certificates in the software-defined perimeter are revoked by deleting the entity or the IP address owning the certificate. Therefore, CRLs and OCSP responders are not needed and therefore cannot be attacked via denial of service attack. For more information on the software-defined perimeter, see enterprise.verizon.com/SDP. Okay, there was a lot of material here. Let's summarize. The purpose of the public key infrastructure is to facilitate trust among entities by being a trusted third party, such that each of the entities trusts the third party. Therefore, the entities should trust each other. In order to do that, PKI creates and distributes X509 digital certificates to trusted entities. Then, PKI provides cryptographic authentication over an untrusted network. PKI consists of the root certificate authority and its associated registration authority and OCSP responder. We mentioned it a couple times, but the root CA should always only issue certificates to subordinate certificate authorities, and it is those subordinate certificate authorities that should issue certificates to entities such as clients, servers, individuals, and organizations. The root CA should never issue certificates to endpoints. Trust is cryptographically chained to the root via hashing the certificate that contains the entity's public key and encrypting the hash with the certificate authority's private key. You may hear that the public implementation of PKI is broken because it may not be fully trustworthy, but the technology is not broken, and the software-defined printer provides a blueprint of how to implement PKI in a trustworthy manner. You should now have a gut-level understanding of PKI. Fun with crypto. Mic drop.